Hello, and welcome to CyberBible 2.0, the online study of the Gospel according to Luke, sponsored by Union United Methodist Church of Quincy, Illinois. I'm Bob Morwell, the pastor. Please remember that this study can be interactive. If you have a question or comment, feel free to post it right here on YouTube, and I'll be glad to respond. We begin this study at chapter 5 of the Gospel. It's believed that Luke was, by profession, a physician, and he evidences great interest in Jesus' healing activities in this chapter. But he begins with Jesus being so pressed by the crowds along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Gennesaret, that he borrows a fishing boat owned by Simon of Capernaum and preaches from a vantage point a few yards offshore. Jesus must have had a pretty good set of lungs on him, because that's a pretty lousy acoustic setup. But it kept people from getting right up in his face or pawing at him while he spoke. Middle Eastern culture does not have nearly the sense of personal space we have here in modern America. After preaching for a while, Jesus instructs Simon, whose mother-in-law he had recently healed from a fever, to put out into deep water and fish. Simon tells him the fishing's been lousy, but he says he'll do it for Jesus. The result is a colossal catch. Luke says they needed the help of other boats to bring it all in. This, along with Jesus' acts of healing and his powerful preaching, simply blows Simon away. He is convinced that Jesus is indeed a holy man. Faced with a wondrous messenger from God, Simon is suddenly and painfully reminded of his relative lack of holiness. He's humbled and asks Jesus to leave him. Jesus had that effect on people. He still does. The man's intimidating, even when he doesn't try to be. And there are people who find the idea of inviting him into their lives, much less following him, downright scary. He is a transformative figure. You see screaming and fainting fans of rock stars and celebrities these days. Imagine, if you can, the presence of someone you felt was genuinely and powerfully touched by God. And even once you get past the more hysterical fans, there are people like Simon who are genuinely awed. And when they think about their own lives in comparison, they can feel a bit of shame as well. Jesus tells Simon not to be afraid, not to let his sense of inadequacy get in the way of an opportunity for service. In the early 1990s, I traveled to Belarus, one of the former Soviet republics, and one of the areas hardest hit by fallout from the Chernobyl disaster. I toured hospitals that were overcrowded and undersupplied. The economy was so bad they couldn't even afford to keep the lights on in the halls, and many rooms were dark and dreary. I saw wards filled with desperately sick and dying children who did not have the medicine they needed to be treated or just to ease their pain. One weary doctor told me about the needs they faced and asked if there was anything I could do to help. I was overwhelmed by the scope of the problem and felt totally inadequate to the challenge, but I told him I would try. At the time, I was pastoring 2 small churches in the Quad Cities. Not exactly a position of great power or influence. But when I returned, I began working with the United Methodist Committee on Relief, our church's emergency aid ministry. Through their good offices and working in cooperation with another ecumenical ministry they found working in Belarus, I was able to return the next year with over $1 million worth of medicine. The year after that, I was able to return again with a shipment of vitally needed medicines. It was far more than I could have ever expected. But the influence of Jesus on all these people who helped make it happen, it was the influence of Jesus that helped make that happen. It was powerful and transforming, and their faith was that God would make a way where no way seemed to exist. And that faith unlocked a miracle. Jesus called on Simon and his friends to have faith in what he was doing and not to focus on their own sense of inadequacy. The results of that would change the world. They left their boats, their old lives, and followed him. Luke then writes of Jesus healing a man with leprosy. This dreaded disease was the AIDS of its time. People who contracted it were exiled from the community and considered cursed by God. To compound the injustice, many other skin diseases which were not leprosy were misdiagnosed as leprosy, and those who suffered from them also became pariahs. Whether the man in the story actually suffered from leprosy or another disease is not known. But in any case, he was suffering, and he approached Jesus to plead for healing. Jesus gladly does so and tells him to go offer sacrifices and gratitude for his cure. He would also have to go to the priests who certified such cures. While leprosy itself could not be cured by the medical practices of the day, some of these other conditions could at least go into remission. But before the sufferer could return to normal life, a priest had to certify that he or she was free of the disease. Jesus asks the man to keep all this quiet, but he can't help telling others once he returns to his family and friends. The result is that Jesus is soon swamped by crowds asking for healing and wanting to get his attention in one way or another. He's eventually overwhelmed by the public demand and withdraws into the wilderness for a while in order to get some peace. Many a pastor, doctor, counselor can relate. To be honest, I'm sort of afraid to look at my cell phone's log these days, just to count up the calls I've received so far this year. There have been weeks when I have been deluged with calls concerning all sorts of crises and times when I have grown weary to the point of exhaustion by the torrent of neediness. There have been times when I have simply switched off my phone for a while in order to get a little peace. After a brief respite, Jesus goes back to work. He goes to an unnamed village in the area and begins healing people. Friends of a man suffering paralysis attempt to get him to Jesus, but the crowd around him is so thick that they settle on an ingenious, if somewhat vandalous, way to get him to the healer. They climb onto the roof, which was probably made of some sort of thatch, and they tear a hole in it in order to lower the paralyzed man to where Jesus is situated. Jesus then does something quite unexpected. We don't know if he spoke with the man first for a while, but at some point he tells them that his sins are forgiven. Not exactly what anyone was expecting them to do or say. Among the people in the crowd are some Pharisees. Pharisees were teachers of the law of Moses. They were known by the title of rabbi, which means teacher in Hebrew. This is Jesus' first confrontation with the Pharisees in Luke's Gospel, and it will be far from the last. So I want to spend a little time explaining who they were, because they're often misunderstood. The Pharisees were not priests. They were part of a religious movement made up of laymen who devoted themselves to the study of the Hebrew Scriptures and to sharing their knowledge with others. They actually made their living through secular jobs and did their teaching for free. Their devotion and piety gained them respect among many people. The word Pharisee comes from the Hebrew word perushim, which means separate ones. One of the doctrines the Pharisees had was that the Jewish people had fallen on hard times because they failed to properly obey the law of Moses, and God was punishing them for their lack of righteousness and piety. The answer, as they saw it, was a greater devotion and study of and obedience to the Scriptures, separating themselves from bad influences like sinners and pagan Gentiles. Over time, the Pharisees divided into various schools of thought, led by rabbis who were especially respected for their learning and piety. Two of these star rabbis created their schools during Jesus' childhood. One was known as Shammai, and he was considered a very strict interpreter of the law. The rules were unbending and had to be enforced strictly, even mercilessly, in his opinion. The other prominent rabbi was Hillel, who has come to be revered as the father of rabbinical Judaism. His approach was that seeking to understand and adhere to the spirit of the law was more important than constantly worrying about sticking to the letter of the law. One of the more humorous but telling examples of these differences between the two men was that Shammai said it was a lie to tell an ugly woman she was beautiful on her wedding day. He didn't advocate going up to her and telling her she was ugly, but you should remain silent on the subject. Hillel, on the other hand, said that all women are beautiful, at least to someone, on their wedding day, and even if you can't see it, you should tell her she's beautiful as an act of kindness. Shammai was a stickler for detail. If you forgot to say grace after a meal, you were supposed to go back to the place where you ate and do so there. It didn't count if you didn't go back to that place. Hillel said that the place wasn't important, the prayer was, so you could and should do it wherever you were when you realized you had previously forgotten to do so. We'll get back to the differences between the two schools of Pharisees later in the study, but suffice it to say that Jesus most likely butted heads with the followers of Shammai, while the followers of Hillel either supported him or at least were willing to hear him out. And Jesus was probably seen by many people as a Pharisee himself, and a student of Hillel, though he would move beyond Hillel. Jesus picks up on their outrage and asks them which is easier, to tell the man he's forgiven for his offenses against God, or to tell him to get up and walk. Their answer is not recorded, but Luke says Jesus then tells the man to stand up and walk, and he does precisely that. The implication is that Jesus has the power to heal this man's dysfunctional body, and so he has the power to repair his wounded soul as well. The physical healing points to spiritual authority, an authority which will be tested and challenged in the next incident. But For that, you'll have to wait till the next episode of CyberBible 2.0, the online Bible study sponsored by Union United Methodist Church of Quincy, Illinois. I invite you to check out our website and Facebook page. And you're always welcome to join us for worship and study each Sunday. I'm Bob Morwell. Peace.